past, one could potentially treat China as a topic, right? The topic called China. Now, however, the realization is increasing that China is not a topic, it is pervasive in all policy fields. Because of its size and influence, it currently impinges on any potential policy field that you can imagine.
The best policies that we can devise, now that Europe is so squeezed in between these two positions in the G2, is something where we can come together and actually transcend the petty differences, because in relation to the challenge that is before us, they are petty in comparison with what awaits us if we don't get our act together.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the European Guanxi podcast. I'm Imogen Parsley, Vice Head of Podcast for this year's team, and I will be your host for this exciting collaboration with the China Knowledge Network. The China Knowledge Network is a Dutch government-initiated platform funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, established to deepen understanding of China's evolving policies, vision, and international role. Managed jointly by the ministries and with think tanks such as the Clingendael Institute, China Knowledge Network brings together academia, policy experts, and researchers across disciplines to inform and enrich Dutch policymaking. With projects like CosmoLab, CKN not only disseminates knowledge through reports and knowledge sessions, but also engages with underlying worldviews and philosophical foundations, challenging assumptions, stimulating epistemic reflection, and broadening the lens through which relations with China are viewed. So today, I'm honored to be joined by Marc Moquette and Simon van Oortmerssen from the China Knowledge Network team. Hello, Marc and Simon.
Good day, Imogen.
In this episode, we'll be focusing on the bigger picture. So that's getting a sense of what the China Knowledge Network's vision is and how this relates to the big picture of Dutch-China-EU relations. So if it's okay, let's begin with your core mission. How does the China Knowledge Network approach the broad and complex challenge of fostering China knowledge and awareness within the Dutch and European diplomatic community?
Yeah, that's a large opening question, but very happy to be here and to have this conversation with you. CKN's core mission is really to bring together the Dutch government and the Dutch China experts so that we can actually link up all of government, including all the 12 ministries that we have in our government system, and some 220 mainly Dutch-based China experts, because that is needed, because China, of course, has presented itself as a challenge to Dutch and European policies. We can talk about that a little later on, but that is the reason why we actually came about. It's our core mission, and we do that, as you have already alluded to in your kind introduction, by developing knowledge that is actually ready-made for use in policies. That's the first half of our mandate, and we collaborate with these ministries, so that's actually quite unique. We don't start any research unless and until government ministries are collaborating actively on asking these questions, so it should be more than just for a one-off for a ministry. And the other side of the core mandate is to develop, I think in one word, to build awareness on where the core challenges actually are and where we find ourselves in a field that is, getting more complicated by the day. And that would be my brief answer.
No, I think as Marc has briefly touched on our core mission and what we do, maybe it's of interest to the listeners to, on the knowledge part, also drill that down in sort of some of the activities that we undertake to increase the knowledge. And maybe we can also talk later about the activities we do to increase awareness. In that sense, when it comes to increasing knowledge, we are very classical in our approach, in that we do the research, as Marc said, only with the collaboration of all the ministries, if there's a shared vision that this is important to Dutch government. But apart from doing research. We also do knowledge sessions, which are mostly on a monthly basis. We do that very practically early in the morning, so the embassies in the Orient, in Asia, can also join in. They are on Capita Selecta on China. That could be anything. We've had a session on the social works department. We've had a session on offshore wind. We've had a session on the large language models currently being developed and how China does that different than Europe. So that really is a very broad spread so as to be attractive to, not maybe in one session, but across the year to all our customers, so to say. And at the same time, what we also do is we offer a masterclass on China. We used to do that once a year, and now, due to popular demand, we do that twice a year, whereby we invite government, civil servants from all levels. So you could be a full-fledged ambassador, or you could be a policy researcher in the ministry, any ministry. As long as China is in on your plate, so to speak, you are more than welcome to join our China Masterclass to basically get a crash course on China, if such a thing is actually possible. But I think, well, the feedback says that we do a good job to get people up to speed. So the research, the knowledge sessions, and the China Masterclass are, I think, the three things through which we, let's say, operationalize our mandate to increase the knowledge in Dutch government. Yeah.
Slight addition, if I may, because I think when we talk about the China Knowledge Network, it's not just Foreign Affairs that runs it. So we are a couple of colleagues, 3 colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are the core team, so to speak. And then there's an external secretariat. We work very closely with the Clingendael Institute, which is the Dutch Institute for International Relations, and the LeidenAsiaCentre. So that's the hub for China studies and Asia studies in Leiden. And together we really work as one team. I think in classical knowledge platforms, you have a separation of roles between the ministry that asks a question and then brings it over to academia that replies, and then a year later you have the answers. We're having a slightly higher frequency, and we're following different paths also in co-developing this knowledge with academics and with ministries.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's provided a really thorough and comprehensive overview of what the China Knowledge Network is and what it does. Something else I think is important and interesting for our listeners to understand is where the idea for the China Knowledge Network came from. So what was the initial drive behind its establishment? And you mentioned that there is a close relationship, not just between China Knowledge Network and academia on China, but also directly with government and with diplomacy. So it's bridging that gap. And so my sort of additional part of this question is, how did the state of Sino-Dutch relations at the time and current affairs at that time shape the mandate of the China Knowledge Network?
I think the initial move was made in 2019. That is also the year that the Commission came out with its strategic outlook on China. And in the same year, a couple of months later, I think the Dutch came out with a policy note explaining that the quality of the relationship with China has changed. And so this was a sort of awareness moment in Dutch politics. And that triggered a couple of actions. So it is a note of cabinet to parliament. And in there, the design was made that we have implemented straight after for a new type of coordination in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs with all of government, because we felt we should be in closer coordination. So we created a China unit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was quite big. I think we now have some 10 to 12 people. It's fluctuating a little bit in that unit, and that makes us one of the more bigger in the European Union. And that was really new, because before that time, we had a China coordinator in an East Asia unit. So there was a real big change. And part of that was also to set up not just the policy coordination bit, but the knowledge development bit. And Simon and I and CKN, we work for this part of the job. And as you've mentioned, obviously, to have a transmission going between what we develop in the China Knowledge Network, where we have insights and understandings that we develop in a networked fashion, that has to land in policy circles. That's the reason why we exist. And for that, you have to be, good neighbors. So the policy people and the knowledge people should not be too close to each other and not too far from each other. And that is what we try to achieve. And I think the reason why this policy note came about and why we chose this solution was that we, at that time, began to understand in politics that we had to change our attitude towards China. And that China was we have the famous triptych that China is a partner with whom you can collaborate, and it is a competitor in a rules-based setting where we can compete, but it is also a systemic rival. And we recognize that explicitly in the policy note. It wasn't very much appreciated by the Chinese side because they felt, you cannot really have a relationship if you call us systemic rivals. I mean, it's not an invitation to cooperate on many fields, but we felt politically it was necessary. And we were, of course, not alone. I mean, the Dutch and the European Union responded to tensions growing in the Sino-American relationship, basically, mainly. And we had to adapt to that situation. And to cut a very long story short, last week, Trump and Xi met in Korea. And after that, we speak of a G2. So, I mean, it just gives you the arc of the big changes that came about in the relationship between US and China, which is the context for us, and how the Dutch and Europeans can adapt to that is, well, one of the principal challenges we stand for now.
China. And so I wanted to probe a little bit more about how you conceptualize knowledge and awareness on China, how you choose what the important topics are that should be discussed, what gets left in, what gets left out of those discussions, and how do you make those decisions on such a complex topic?
I think the essence of our decision making is consists of a number of parts. First of all, what sets us apart from other China knowledge initiatives in the European Union is that we really co-decide, and we have a lot of conversations going on between these ministries. So there is a permanent conversation on the strategic approach to take, but we also translate that to undertake studies that should be relevant government-wide. So we cover really all questions, and Simon already alluded to that, but ranging from the situation of Chinese immigrants in Europe and the Netherlands and what this generational build-up as a social question in Europe actually changes in the way, for example, Chinese NGOs in Europe organize. So, I mean, that's very relevant for our Ministry of Social Affairs, for example. But then we have another subject, which is very relevant for our Ministry of Finance and for Foreign Affairs and Economic Affairs, which is on a totally unrelated topic, like the internationalization of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, which is a fundamental trend underlying much of the complexity that we see in the trade files, and also in even up to military concerns. So, I mean, these are two very different topics. It just by way of illustration what the span of control is that we have, because China is such a complex challenge. And you asked also, as to our approach, it's not just coming up with clever questions and then giving that to think tanks and academics and then wait the answers and plug that in our policy approach. It is also very much this permanent conversation, and how do you go about developing our awareness of where we stand? And I think that merits unpacking a little bit, because it's really half of our mandate, and we take it very seriously. We try to do that sort of situational awareness development, which is permanent. And we try to do that not in academic studies, but in conversations, some private, some public. And nice illustrations of that you can find in, for example, an essay booklet that we published some 2 years ago on undercurrents in the geopolitical relationship with China, sort of everything you always wanted to know but were afraid to ask, because there's lots of taboos in this sphere, and you cannot tackle that, just in the political open because it's too sensitive. And another way to do it is what we recently undertook last year, and we're still working on that right now, is a project like our Cosmolab, which is a conversation on the foundation of how actually we ourselves look at this relationship and at international relations. And if you have a serious conversation on that, and you are aware that you need this serious conversation because the complexity of the challenge is so great, then you also have to really invest in it. So we talk to German philosophers and Italian physicists and many other types in a permanent conversation, trying to get our heads around the complexity of the challenge and what we actually can do. But that's a long arc. You go from these philosophical foundations all the way to transmitting good ideas, for policies. And that's a big span of control.
What we're slowly trying to, what the observation is that is now being shared by a lot of colleagues, if I may say so, is that in the past, one could potentially treat China as a topic, right? The topic called China. And therefore you could have one topical study, China studies, and that would seal the deal. You would have the knowledge and you would be done. Now, however, the realization is increasing that China is not a topic, it is pervasive in all policy fields. Because of its size and influence, it currently impinges on any potential policy field that you can imagine. As Marc alluded, it might be the Ministry of Social Affairs, it might also be the Ministry of Defense, it might be the Ministry of Finance, etc., etc. So one of the first shifts is to move from topic to, let's say, systemic, right? China is part of the system. And then, as Marc was pointing out, as we've been doing on the awareness part, once you realize that China is part of the system, comes the next step, and that is to realize that you, as an entity that partakes in the system, is also part of that very same system. And that's when the dynamic becomes interesting to start living with what has been termed VUCA a long time ago, that we really wanted a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and we now have it. And how are we going to deal with it, right? And that's why the whole awareness part is also so important, because if you keep looking at China through a topical lens, you're missing the big picture. If you also look at it at a systemic lens without including yourself, you're missing the even bigger picture. So it is about getting your framework right in order to understand the magnitude at which you need to consider yourself and China in any policy discussion. That, of course, does not mean that you can sometimes not say, well, let's zoom in and put a framework around it and be very clear and concise in the demarcation of your research, and be very specific on the policy that you want to establish and the actions you want to take and the results you want to achieve, but not without forgetting the bigger picture.
Maybe just a little thing to add to try to give some beef, because this is very abstract what we discuss right now. And I think it's sensitive. That's why we give a lot of time to it. It's important, but it's also, it can render your policies very concrete. I mean, we have conversations on, for example, the topic of our reality blindness or energy blindness or materials blindness. So then we talk with people who are not China experts, but they see, let's say, the biophysical reality of which actually our geopolitical focus is a part. It's embedded in that biophysical reality. And we feel, for example, it's very important to open up this relationship between the biophysical reality, and just one example is raw materials, not just the rare earth predicament that we find ourselves in, not for the first time. And we've seen this coming a long time. It's just that we've never acted on it. So that's also a politically difficult message to deliver to the public right now. But physically speaking, the problem, the core problem, is actually something that is way more where China, Europe, and the US are way more codependent, which is that for example, the amount of energy that is necessary to produce the materials that is necessary to produce the goodies that keep our economies growing is going up radically. And why is this? This is because we live in a sort of post-peak material world where actually the density of this material is getting lighter and lighter. It's getting lesser and lesser. So you need more materials and more energy to work on before you can get productive raw materials, that are ready to use in industrial processes and feed our value chains. And so if we don't mend our ways, and that includes how we operate in this field, and there are no innocent bystanders here, we're all guilty, then this is going to end in violence. And it's very clear where it's going right now. So we feel you need these in-depth conversations, and we also want to make them public, to keep the public informed, and to have open public choice on these really difficult questions. And that's a concrete way of trying to get our geopolitical people into a biophysical conversation and vice versa. That's just one way we try to link up different fields of knowledge and expertise. And that's very far away from just China as an object or an entity, as Simon said. That it just illustrates the systemic character of our relationship and the need to include ourselves in any equation that will be successful policy-wise if we want to keep things peaceful.
Thank you very, very much. I was originally planning to ask a question about skills. So we've spoken about knowledge, about awareness, and I was kind of thinking as you were describing these different fields, describing how China is not just a topic, but now a systemic part of a system that we as individuals are also part of. I was thinking to myself, what skills must it now take to be able to be somebody who can call themselves an expert on China? I guess language skills are important. Can you speak Chinese? Academic research skills are also important. But as I was thinking more about the complexities of China as one part of this big system, I suppose you also need to be a political scientist, a lawyer, a historian, a literary scholar, an omnipotent, all-knowing being almost to know everything about China. And I suppose this leads me to start thinking that maybe actually the answer really is about teamwork. And that's both internal teamwork, and that's exactly what CKN is doing, right? Is helping people to listen to each other, but also teamwork with China or with the US or with other global geopolitical entities to resolve these systemic issues. So both internal and kind of external teamwork. What does that, how do you reflect on that? Do you think that teamwork is the answer here, or is that overly simplifying the message?
Yeah. So I like your thinking there. If I go, let me try and answer it in a few ways. So the first reflection on your question in terms of skills that came up was, if you take that lens of topical, systemic, and self being part of it as well, you need to have topical knowledge, right? So you need to have a form of expertise in the field that you do, whether that be law or politics, right? Just to understand that field in itself. Second, of course, the China aspect. It is widely acknowledged that Chinese is a very difficult language to learn and is a different language from any of the languages spoken, at least in Europe. And that comes with a lot of implications. The culture is different as well. So skills on those two are an absolute necessity as well, in my view. Of course, you can have a lot of assistance with IT, but it's good to understand what IT is doing for you. So the topical knowledge and the China knowledge, then I think there is a part that goes to the, so how do you view the systemic nature of the situation we're in, right? So that the ability to zoom out from the topic and to seek the interlinkages and understand the interrelation of the problem, not to complicate matters further, but just to indicate where that sits, is, I think, is an added skill to have. And then the third one is maybe a bit more mysterious in that sense, but if you want to acknowledge fundamentally that you yourself are a part of the system, you need to have self-knowledge, right? So if you get very happy when you research something on China, it's good to know that you get happy. If you get very angry when you research something on China, it's so equally good to know that you're getting angry. So I think that self-awareness part is part of the equation, because perception drives reality, right? If you're colored by your emotions, that's how you perceive things. And that happens as an individual, as an organization, and as a nation. So those are, I think, at those three levels, these are useful skills to have. The other way I wanted to answer your question was to think about that when you said teamwork, if you take the international, the situation on the planet with all the different countries and the way they're interlinked, right? I had to, somehow the image of a body, right? A human physical body came up. And in the same way that there is no one doctor that does everything for the whole body, when it comes to China and specifically, you've got different topical expertise, etc. So in a hospital, you have different doctors. They all work on the same body, and they are hopefully, and I think as far as my personal experience goes, blissfully aware that if you do something with one part of my body, other parts respond, right? When you do an operation, it's nice to have anesthetics, for example, right? But indeed, the key there is there is teamwork needed and knowledge of the whole. I think that also lends me the opportunity to use the analogy of what we sometimes jokingly refer to or work to as a geopolitical acupuncture, right? Because you just don't simply take out a whole heart or a whole country because you don't like it or whatever personal situation might be going on. But maybe with some small, focused intervention, things flow again. And be that knowledge, be that policy, that's an open debate. But I like that analogy as well. So it's the maybe with the word holistic approach is also a very good skill to start working on. I think those are the two lenses I had in mind. Marc, anything to add?
That's a dangerous question if you ask me, because I always have something to add. But I think in this particular instance, I also like very much the notion of teamwork, because, CKN is not an answering machine. What we can do is to offer a bit of, networking, sometimes a bit of therapy. Don't underestimate how afraid our colleagues are for good ideas if they're not politically expedient. I mean, we're ministries, we work in a political environment, and that is by necessity politicized. So one part of our role is also to be at arm's length of this executive machine that has to deliver for politics, and to sometimes, to work out and develop a bit more Simon's analogy with geopolitical acupuncture, to then say, well, I think we have a needle treatment for you here. And then the first response is invariably, no, I don't need it, because I already know how this works. And yet after the treatment, people feel better. So, I mean, it is, apart from the fact that you need skills in a technical sense and in an analytical sense, and you have to be self-aware how you are yourself part of the challenge that we try to solve, you also have to be, I think, strong in a relational sense. Not just because this is necessary in teamwork, but it is also necessary analytically. The best policies that we can devise, now that Europe is so squeezed in between these two positions in the G2, is something where we can come together and actually, transcend the petty differences, because in relation to the challenge that is before us, European differences, be they industrial or military or on other political levels, they are petty in comparison with what awaits us if we don't get our act together. And that's why I think you really need interpersonal skills to try to get a conversation going on the stuff we really have to address. And that includes ourselves. That includes Europe. You know, we all know the Draghi report and the recipes, and we have to spend more. But Europe is the smallest continent, if it is a continent at all. We like to think of it as a continent. I think it's more a subcontinent, but it's the smallest of all. It's the oldest of all in the sense of population age. You know, it's resource poor, and it has a very big mouth. So and this needs a bit of therapy. I mean, that's the short version. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoy these kind of medical analogies to try and understand how China's fitting in with the broader global system. I think it's very beneficial to me, hopefully to our listeners as well, to be able to like really visualize this broader picture. I want to pick up on something you were, or a large part of what you were saying about sharing knowledge, about sort of collectively almost healing, this almost collective healing that has to happen within Europe in order to be able to approach China, relate to China and to other countries across the world in a more healthy way. I wanted to ask, what role do you think shared knowledge and understanding plays in achieving more coherence, a more generally coherent strategic position on China? And how do you envision the future of this shared knowledge building? Do you imagine every country in Europe having a China knowledge network, or would it make more sense for countries within Europe to unify their China knowledge or almost centralize their China knowledge?
I think it's and we have to do it. It's a layered approach. What we with the CKN try to achieve in the Netherlands is difficult enough the way it is, but it's also very necessary in Brussels. It's obviously that in Brussels a lot of the decisions are being taken, whether they are formally mandated or not. I mean, the pressure is so big that Brussels is really growing beyond its competence as a sort of a trade machine, which it basically is, and is going into geopolitics right now. So there's a lot of hand wringing and a lot of conversation going on in Brussels right now that is on or over the border, the frontier of what the EU was set out to do. And these conversations, we should be a part of it. That is where a lot of the decision making is being prepared and where you have influence that is necessary in addition to the influence that we have at home. And so that is also one of the reasons why CKN is collaborating. We have our German partner Merix, and we have our Swedish partner NKK, the National China Center of Sweden. And the three of us, we have decided as of this year to work together to gradually move into that space and to have a more coordinated effort. And you asked also, should it be centralized or not? The jury is still out. We discuss that regularly, what is the best thing to do, and we think we need both. So on the one hand, you have to centralize, because sometimes you can't do the healing with your needle. You need heavier stuff to intervene, and that has to be prepared as well. And that is not just a matter of allowing the policy process and the policy coordination to take its course, but we need to thicken the plot in Brussels itself to offer the same access to this deeper reality that we are also a part of, and to have that sense also being imbued in the conversation in Brussels. So, I mean, that is what we set out to do, and that also asks for decentralized approaches. And so we also set out to collaborate with a spread of China and non-China initiatives in Brussels to get this teamwork that you mentioned yourself going in Brussels. And I think that's a very important part. And on top of that, we don't want to limit ourselves to Brussels and The Hague or to Europe. We actively set out to discuss these matters with countries from the global south. We need a different type of relationship that at the same time is more transactional and where we can establish more trust as the Netherlands and as Europe to produce partnerships that are beneficial to all, and that also requires self-knowledge on the part of Europe. It's not just transactional in the sense of stepping forward and proposing a nice transaction in the trade sphere. You won't pull it off. You have to be clear on what your long-term vision is and how you will adapt your own ways in order to attract people to collaborate with you when you're no longer so dominant as we used to be. So this is actually a real challenge to our still live and kicking attitudes of sometimes neocolonialism that we have to get rid of, also in the way we contact other countries. And then to top it all off, we think it's also necessary, and we work towards that aim, to talk to Chinese counterparts directly. We are also very much aware that we need to differentiate how and with whom we talk. China and Europe, neither of them is a monolith. And we need lots of contacts and lots of conversations to offer ourselves more clarity on what is possible to collaborate and to compete within rule-based areas that we agree on. That's very difficult, and it's extremely challenging, I can say, at this moment, precisely because the security threat is so great. But when the security threat is so great as it is right now, it also means, when the going gets tough, the tough need to get going, and it's not a reason to close down and securitize our relationship with China. You also have to work around it. We do it at several levels, but the China Knowledge Network is also a part of that. So direct conversation about these topics in China and with Chinese is very much part of our ambition.
Yeah, and if I may add on that, but from a slightly different angle, maybe as an example, right, of what the state of the nation within Europe is vis-a-vis China. The European think tank network on China issued a report, I think it was their either 23 or 24 report, where they analyzed the various countries' policies and stances vis-a-vis China. And I think somewhere, for those of you who are interested, you can look it up, and in the executive summary you'll find sort of a box plot where you'll find that there is no Europe, there's just countries on the whole spectrum of stances vis-a-vis China. And that made me think of the coherence, the word that you use there, in the classical physical sense or physics sense of the word, right? If you share the same knowledge, that amplifies, right? It's like two waves that amplify. If you are on a dissimilar page, it's two waves that null out, so you deadlock, and that is very much what you have seen, and if you were to go to some of these, the latest ETNC conference was a good case in point. There were also some interesting presentations of, let's say, different views on China within Europe at this moment, which if you kind of take them on the whole, cancel out to no action taken. And sometimes no action is the best action, and I will be the last one to exclude that option. But in this case, I think that some action might be better than no action. But then the question, of course, is how do you get to a same point of view position, right? And there's a lot of factors in play. From within our mandate, we definitely do believe, and there's enough evidence to support, that having the same knowledge and the same awareness greatly helps to getting to a same perspective. Of course, there will be small differences, but that is definitely where not only CKN with its partners in the Netherlands, but also all the initiatives that Marc referred to with our partners in Europe, sometimes in a fixed constellation, sometimes maybe in a more fluid constellation, can definitely help out. I always like to think that, if Europe wants to achieve a certain result, right? Result is always a consequence of having taken an action. Otherwise, you won't get a result or something else acts for you, right? And actions you usually take based on a certain policy. And that policy is usually founded on a certain knowledge, right? So the moment you start at the front, something that we're very fond of saying in the Dutch government, steer at the front, right? If you start on the same page at the front, there's a higher chance that the result is also on the same page at the end. So these just maybe some practical examples to exemplify what Marc was saying.
I think something that I always feel when listening to your points and perspectives, especially just on the importance of knowledge, it all personally resonates with me, and I'm sure many of our listeners who are, many of them students, researching China, engaging in China, in this difficult job market at present. It can sometimes feel like maybe studying China wasn't the most employable option. But conversations like this really remind me just how important it really is to understand China, that you are taking a important and valuable route by growing your knowledge, by engaging in knowledge on China, and that knowledge is actually critical for the future. So a note to the listeners: keep studying, keep working on China, and keep listening to our podcast, where you can learn even more. Just a quick plug. So coming up, we will be having more episodes with the China Knowledge Network, touching on a wider range of topics where you can learn even more to build your knowledge and awareness and become one of these China experts that we speak of so fondly.